The last entry in Dr. Elias Whitcomb's journal is dated November 14th, 1867. The ink blot at the end of the final sentence suggests he never had the chance to finish it. It reads, "The boy does not blink when he watches people suffer. His stillness is worse than violence. I believe the words trail off. By sunrise, Dr. Whitcomb would be gone, and Timothy Caldwell, the 8-year-old at the center of his obsessive study, would become a name whispered in locked kitchens and behind closed shutters, a name that never appeared in any official history. For over 150 years, the details remained buried, until a box surfaced in the archives of a long-defunct asylum. Inside were 3 things: a torn photograph of a child with pale eyes, a collection of sketches that could not have been drawn by innocent hands, and a length of rope stiff with age. This is not the story of an ordinary crime. It is the story of something older, something colder, that took root in the mind of a child before science even had a name for it. Before you decide whether you believe what you're about to hear, ask yourself this: if a monster wears the face of a boy, how many chances would you give him before you recognized what he was? Backstory and world-building. The year was 1867. Missouri was still limping out of the Civil War's shadow, its fields littered with abandoned homesteads, its people carrying invisible wounds. In places like Hallow's Bend, 20 miles south of Sedalia, the war had stripped away the bright varnish of civility. It left behind lean years, colder winters, and a kind of suspicion that made neighbors glance twice before waving. The Caldwell farm sat low in the valley, a patchwork of withered pasture and cornfields that seemed to soak up more shadow than sun. The house itself 2 stories of weathered oak leaned slightly east, as though bowing to some invisible weight. People said the land had been good once, fertile. That was before James Caldwell went off to fight in 1861 and returned in a pine box. His wife, Margaret, followed him into the grave 4 years later, her lungs rotted by winter consumption. When the last of the war's letters arrived, bearing news that another Caldwell son, William, had died in a Confederate prison camp, what remained of the family line was passed to the living: Thomas Caldwell and his wife, Eleanor. They inherited more than soil and bets. They inherited the boy. Timothy Caldwell arrived in the spring thaw of '66, stepping down from a wagon that smelled of wet earth and iron. He was small. Too small, some thought, for a boy of 7. His hair was pale as dry straw, cropped close against the scalp. His eyes, clear, icy blue, had none of the restless sparkle that marked children his age. In town, they said he was polite. Yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Always quick to offer help with chores. Never fussing, never sulking. But in the way he watched you too long, too still, there was something that made even grown men turn away first. The Pattersons, who lived across the ridge, swore their chickens refused to go near the fence whenever the boy lingered in the fields. Horses skittish at his approach. Dogs that once greeted strangers with wagging tails now hid beneath porches. People laughed it off. Animals get notions. But the jokes thinned as the weeks went on. The Caldwell farm kept to itself. Thomas worked the land with a quiet stubbornness. Eleanor managed the kitchen and smokehouse. Together, they took Timothy in not out of kindness, but necessity. Extra hands meant a better harvest, and the boy did not complain. From dawn to dusk he labored, carrying water from the creek, turning soil with the mule, mending fence wire with fingers too thin for the pliers. And never, not once, did anyone see him at play. Other boys carved whistles from willow branches. They raced along the dirt roads, whooping like wild colts. Timothy never joined them. If he paused at all, it was to stand alone by the old cottonwood tree at the edge of the pasture, his head tilted as if listening to something far off, something no one else could hear. On Sundays, they sat in the narrow pew of Hallow's Bend Chapel. The minister, Reverend Booth, recalled that the boy kept his head bowed through the hymns, but his lips never moved. Sometimes, Booth would catch Timothy staring at the baptismal font as though it were a specimen jar. One morning, after service, the Reverend placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and asked, "Do you believe in the Lord's mercy?" Timothy's answer was simple. If he's real, he watches everything, even the things people hide. It was the first time the Reverend Booth admitted to feeling uneasy in his own church. Rising tension, the summer of 1867 in Hallow's Bend was a season of small misfortunes. Not the sort that sends riders galloping for the sheriff, but the kind that piles up like storm clouds. No one notices until the first flash of lightning. It began with the wells. Water that had run clear for years turned faintly bitter, leaving a metallic tang on the tongue. Reverend Booth blessed each in turn, declaring it a passing curse of nature. But when the Whitcomb family's bucket came up with a dead blackbird, floating inside, word traveled fast. Not long after, Mrs. Maddox claimed she found the door of her smokehouse ajar one morning. Inside, the salted pork was untouched, but each slab bore 3 shallow cuts, clean and deliberate. Her husband laughed it off as a prank, but she remembered, with a small tightening in her throat, that Timothy Caldwell had been sent to borrow lard from her just days before. And then there were the fires. Small ones, contained before they spread, yet always curious in their placement. A patch of grass behind the Miller barn. A bale of hay smoldering inside the Latham stables. When asked, the boy had explanations. He'd been near the barn because he thought he heard coyotes. He'd been in the stables because a latch was loose. No one could prove anything. But after the second fire, old Mrs. Latham began locking her doors in broad daylight. From the Journal of Dr. Elias Whitcomb, dated July 21st, 1867, the child does not exhibit fear. He mimics it, yes, tilted head, widened eyes, but the muscles around the mouth never match the eyes. When I described to him the suffering of cholera patients, he asked if the spasms continued after breath stopped. He asked it politely, without malice. But there is something in the politeness that is worse than cruelty. Rumors cling to a small town like frost to glass. One said the boy had been seen crouched in the orchard past midnight, running his fingers over the antlers of a half-rotted deer carcass. Another claimed he'd been spotted in the attic of the abandoned Lambert house, staring out through the cracked window at the street below. No one asked him about it directly. In Hallow's Bend, it was easier to pretend you hadn't seen. The first accident came in August, when little Clara Booth, niece to the Reverend, wandered too close to the creek behind the chapel. She was pulled out by her brother, soaked too, the skin and sobbing about someone who had tried to push her head under. The Reverend assured his congregation it was nothing. The child had slipped, but privately he found her words troubling. She said the hands on her head were small. Around the same time, the Patterson family began losing their hens. Not to foxes, nor to hawks. The bodies were always intact, the necks broken neatly as though by an unseen hand. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned it to Eleanor Caldwell at the market, Timothy was standing nearby, weighing apples in his small palms. He smiled without looking up and said, "Sometimes animals just stop working inside." Eleanor laughed awkwardly. Mrs. Patterson didn single quotes T. Dr. Whitcomb, who visited the Caldwell farm, often under the guise of tending Thomas's back injury, began keeping his own quiet tally. Missing animals. Small injuries that Timothy seemed to notice before anyone else. Children who came home from playing in the fields pale and subdued, unable or unwilling to explain why. What he noticed most was the boy's interest in boundaries. Not fences or property lines, but the invisible limits of people. How close could he stand before they stepped back? How much could he ask before their smile faltered? What could he say that would linger in their minds long after he'd gone? One evening in late August, the doctor found Timothy sitting alone in the pasture, legs folded neatly beneath him. At his feet was a toad, unmoving. Its belly was slit open in a clean, precise line. The boy looked up and said, "If you watch closely, you can see which parts stop moving first." No one in Hallow's Bend could point to one undeniable act that proved the wrongness of the Caldwell boy. But the unease was there now, in the way conversations would stall when his name came up, in the way shutters closed a little. Earlier each evening, the storms were gathering, and no one yet knew that the first true strike was only days away. The breaking point on the last Sunday of August, the air over Hallow's Bend felt heavy enough to drink. The sun hung low, swollen and red in the haze, and the clouds were building the way they do before a storm dark on the bottom. Copperhead. The edges that was the afternoon Emma Holt vanished. Emma was 6. Bright-eyed, with braids that never stayed tied, and a habit of pocketing shiny things, pebbles, buttons, coins she found in the dust. Her mother sent her out to gather kindling before supper. She never came back. By nightfall, the entire valley was searching lanterns swinging, boots trampling the brittle grass. Voices carried in the warm dark, calling her name over and over. Timothy Caldwell joined the search party. He was tireless. The boy wove through the brush, ahead of the grown men, ducking under branches, skirting the creek's edge with a sure-footedness no one else had done. It was Timothy who called out first. Emma was found in the shallows beneath the willow grove, her small body tangled in the trailing roots. The water there was barely deep enough to cover her chest, yet her lungs were full. Dr. Whitcomb crouched in the mud to examine her. The girl's lips were pale, her hands curled inward. No sign of injury, except for 2 faint crescent marks on the back of her neck, just above the collar of her dress. When he asked how Timothy had spotted her in the dark, the boy said simply, "I knew where to look." The doctor didn't press him, not there. But he noticed something, the way Timothy stood slightly apart from the crowd as they lifted Emma's body, watching with the cool focus of a man memorizing the steps to a procedure. Not grief, not horror. Observation. By morning, word had spread. The Reverend told the congregation it was an accident. A child playing near the water, losing her balance. But Mrs. Holt swore her daughter had been afraid of the creek. And then there were the marks. Doctor Whitcomb said nothing publicly, but in his journal that night, his handwriting turned sharper. The indentations are not consistent with rocks or roots. They are finger marks, small ones. After Emma's burial, the valley tried to resume its rhythms. But people noticed things they might have ignored before. 2 days later, Mr. Lapham claimed he saw Timothy standing in the middle of the road at dawn, staring toward the Holt house. The Patterson children refused to play near the fence line. Then came the second death. Hugh Carter, a retired sawyer who lived alone near the bluff, was found at the base of the rock's neck broken, limbs twisted at impossible angles. His walking stick was still wedged in the fence at the top of the bluff, and scattered around his body in the grass were the corpses of several honeybees, their wings still trembling. Timothy had been cutting through on his way back from town when he saw the shape at the bottom. When asked about the bees, Timothy suggested maybe Hugh had disturbed a hive and stumbled back in fright. But when Dr. Whitcomb climbed to the bluff to investigate, the hives were untouched. The bees still worked quietly in the late summer flowers. By September, the tension was thick enough to taste. Lanterns burned later in windows. Children were called inside before dusk. The unspoken truth was this: every misfortune now seemed to have Timothy Caldwell somewhere in its shadow. And then Jacob Ayers disappeared. Jacob was 8, the same age as Timothy and fearless in a way only certain boys can be. He was last seen following someone along the wooded path toward the old stone, well north of the creek. His body wouldn't be found for 4 days. And by then, the line between accident and something else would be impossible to defend. This was the moment Hallow's Ben stopped whispering about the Caldwell boy and began to wonder aloud whether the devil himself could be small enough to fit in a child's skin. Aftermath and dark secrets by the time they pulled Jacob Ayers from the bottom of the well, Hallow's Bend had already rehearsed the phrases. Terrible accident. Poor parents. Children wander. But the truth would not fit neatly into those words. Jacob was alive when they found him. Merely, his lips were cracked, his voice too faint to answer questions, his eyes unfocused as though staring at something far away. He died that evening before midnight. The old well had been covered with branches and brambles, arranged too neatly to be the work of wind or chance. When Timothy was asked how he found Jacob, he answered, "I heard him crying." Dr. Whitcomb tested. This himself. Standing above the covered well in broad daylight, he heard nothing but the slow drip of water. That night, Whitcomb went back alone. The moon was thin, barely lighting the path. On the inner stones, just below the lip, were scratches. Not desperate, erratic scratches. Straight, deliberate marks. 7 in one cluster, 3 in another. Like Tally's dot from Whitcomb's journal, September 9th. This is no longer coincidence. If my suspicions are correct, the boy has moved from animals to human subjects. The methods are deliberate. The concealment is deliberate. And the choice of victim. Each has been small enough to control, yet different enough to test variables. In the weeks after Jacob's death, the Caldwell farm grew quieter. Thomas's back kept him to bed more often, and Eleanor's headaches became frequent. Timothy worked the fields alone, and no one could say for certain where he spent his evenings. Whitcomb began to notice patterns. Timothy never whistled or hummed while working. He held tools as though their intended use was secondary, as if measuring them for something else. Then came Mrs. Patterson's observation. She had been gathering apples when she saw Timothy slipping into the trail that led to the limestone caves beyond the far pasture. The next morning, Whitcomb followed that path. The entrance was low and half-hidden under vines. Inside, the air was cool and still. Bones littered the ground, small ones first, then larger. Deeper in, he found a row of crude instruments, farm shears filed to points, iron hooks, a hammer with a handle worn smooth. Beside them, a stack of papers weighted with a stone. Drawings. They were detailed. Anatomical. Animals splayed open. Limbs severed. Each image marked with neat handwriting describing reaction times, breath durations, resistance before collapse. Beneath, the first dozen pages, the subjects changed. Emma Holt in the shallows. Hugh Carter sprawled against stone. Jacob Ayers in the well. And one final page. Blank, except for a name. Eleanor Caldwell. Whitcomb took one sketch for proof, leaving the rest. Some part of him wanted to see what would happen if the boy didn't know his secret had been found. By mid-October, the pattern was undeniable. The experiments had moved beyond opportunity into planning. The next subject would be someone in his own house. Whitcomb began spending evenings at the Caldwell farm under the pretense of checking Thomas's recovery. He brought extra laudanum, enough to keep Thomas and Eleanor heavy-limbed if Timothy chose that night to act. The sheriff was told enough to keep watch, but not enough to dismiss him as mad. On November 10th, Whitcomb arrived early. The farm was too quiet. The animals were still. Timothy appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled above his elbows, hands scrubbed raw and pink. "I've been waiting for you," he said. Lingering dread enclosing hooked Thomas and Eleanor lay side by side in their bed, pale and slack-jawed, breathing shallowly. On the knit-stand beside them, a wooden bowl still slick with liquid at the bottom. Whitcomb turned and found Timothy standing in the doorway, holding a coil of rope in one hand. "I thought you might like to watch," the boy said. "Watch what?" Whitcomb asked. "How people die when they know it's coming." "I've only tried it with animals. You hold them, and they look at you until they don't anymore. People might be different." He placed the rope on the table, then laid out other items: a paring knife, a carpenter's awl, a hammer. Each was placed with surgical precision. Whitcomb kept him talking. "And if I stopped you? Then you'd be part of the experiment. The part about what people choose when there's no good choice. Do they run? Do they fight? Or do they just stand still and wait?" Outside, the sheriff and 2 deputies crouched low in the frost-stiff grass. Whitcomb had left word for them to be close. Inside, Timothy stepped closer. A knife caught the lamplight. "You've been following me," he said. "Into the woods, into the caves, touching my things. I knew you'd come here tonight, because you can't help yourself. You want to know why I do it." The first move was fast. The knife grazed Whitcomb's sleeve. He caught the boy's wrist, felt the wiry strength, and shoved him back against the table. The bowl tipped. Laudanum splashed across the floor. Both of them were still for a moment. Then Timothy smiled. "See? You're fighting. I knew you would." Boots pounded on the porch. The back door burst inward. "Drop it, boy," the sheriff said. Timothy lowered the knife slowly, almost thoughtfully, and let it fall. The deputies bound his hands. He didn't struggle. As they led him out into the cold, Timothy looked over his shoulder. "You're going to tell them everything," he said. "And they'll think you're lying, or crazy, and someone else will want to know how my mind works. Someone will let me keep going. That's the part you can't stop." The official record said Timothy Caldwell was taken into custody on suspicion of attempting to harm his guardians. It didn't say he spent less than a year confined before being moved to an institute in St. Louis. It didn't say that institute burned to the ground in the winter of 1869, and it didn't say the bodies of 3 staff and 4 patients were never recovered. Years later, a carpenter found a small wooden box in an attic in Sedalia. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a drawing of a farmhouse with 2 figures outside. One was unmistakably Dr. Whitcomb. The other was a child with pale hair. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, "Experiment continues. If the devil wears a groan, man's face, you can see him coming. If he wears the face of a boy, you'll never see him until he's close enough to touch."